Let's talk motive for a second. One of the reasons why so many people believe that Bryan Kohberger is innocent is because they have yet to have been able to establish any kind of connection between Kohberger and the victims. And people feel like, well, if there's no connection, then there's no motive. And that's not necessarily true. You don't have to have a personal connection to your victim for your motive to be personal or to have any kind of motive at all. So we have four commonly known motives for murder: love, lust, loot, and loathing. And love is sort of an angel of death situation where the person committing the crime thinks they're putting somebody out of their misery or out of taking the suffering away. Love is typically a love triangle or an obsessed lover or something where that's very one-sided. Loot is exactly what it sounds like, money. And loathing is a developed intense hatred for a group, organization, or specific person. If we dig a little bit deeper, there's four common factors considered when determining when analyzing a violent criminal and trying to determine their motive. And the first is physiological. Are they genetically predisposed to commit violent crime? The next is developmental. Did they have any kind of history of childhood trauma, like abuse? The next one is psychopathological, and this has to do with mental disorders. Now, typically when mental disorders are involved with a violent crime, it has to do with the person that with their disorder not being properly treated, not being managed, or having experienced some kind of really intense stressor or psychotic break. And the last one is social, like socioeconomic backgrounds. You know, certain areas where we live, there's higher crime because of socioeconomic issues. Something that's also important to understand is that there can be sort of a commingling of these factors, right? Like, and a good example I think would be Ted Bundy, right? His mother didn't tell him who his real father was during childhood, and that was very traumatic for him. And then he developed this seething hatred for women. And he didn't necessarily have a personal connection to all of his victims. Israel Keyes had no personal connection to all of his victims. And when they asked him why he committed all these crimes, he just said, why not? So it's a myth that there needs to be a personal connection in order for there to be a motive. My belief is, and I think I've made it pretty clear, that I think Bryan Kohberger is guilty. And the reason I think that is because of the documented issues he's had with women. You know, he was in that training program when he was younger, and the teacher had to take him out of that program because there were issues with women, and he had to be put in to another program with all men. There were the issues with the bar owner where he would come in and say inappropriate things to the bar staff, and that they had to essentially like ban him from the bar. There are the numerous stories from female students of his that said he graded women harder, he talked down to women, he was more likely to skip classes if it was taught by a woman professor. So all these things combined, to me, seem like they demonstrate an intense dislike or loathing for women. And so a lot of times with loathing, when loathing is the motive, who this person kills isn't necessarily there isn't necessarily a personal connection, but they choose somebody or somebodies that represent the group or organization that they hate. And in this case, I think it was women. I don't think he was stalking anybody. I think he was stalking the house. And I think he was stalking or trying to determine the activity, the comings and goings of that house. A lot of people say, well, he must have been in that house in order for him to know where to go. And I'm going to show you why that's not true. As you can see, the sliding door in the kitchen, if he came in here, all he would have to do is walk to the entryway of the kitchen, and the stairs going to the third floor were directly to his right. He didn't have to know where to go. It was all presented right for him. He didn't need a map. He didn't need to understand the layout because the layout was presented presented for him. It was actually quite easy for him to figure out where to go. And then when he came down the stairs, those stairs were right across from the sort of the foyer. And if he heard Xana down in her room or just heard noise, he could have just followed it. He didn't need to know the layout. He didn't need to have been in the house before. And I know that Kaylee's dad has always maintained that there was a connection between Kohberger and the victims. And I think a lot of that has to do, I'm just going to say, I'm going to call it trauma brain. Now, according to Kaylee's dad, when they found out the name of the suspect arrested, they went to social media and they looked him up. And they immediately found his page. And on this page, he followed all of the girls. He liked a bunch of Maddie's photos. And so he said he believes that this is real. Now, here's the thing. I've said from the beginning that I never thought they were going to find a connection between Kohberger and the victims, because this guy made some mistakes, but in terms of anything leading up to the crime, he was very smart. And one of the things I believe is that he would not have any kind of digital trail to the victims. But not only that, if he did, let's say he did follow them, I don't think he would have still been following them after the murders. I think he would have unfollowed them. I know a lot of people who looked Kohberger up the minute his name was announced and nobody found anything. And within like 30 minutes, that's when all the profiles started popping up. And they were all like spam profiles, older profiles that people just changed with new information and a new profile photo to make it look like Kohberger's profile. But most of them were just old profiles that had been created several months before. Kaylee's mom, Christy, did an interview with the Drunk Turkey podcast, and she said that they found out the suspect's name before the arrest. And then Steve did an interview, and he said that they found out the name at the same time everybody else did. And I see a lot of this with Kaylee's parents, where one says one thing and one says the other. And what I said about trauma brain, your short-term memory is fried when you experience an intense trauma. So it's very difficult to retain information, or very difficult to retain information correctly. And so I could see them looking him up the day of the arrest and finding all those profiles, but remembering it as the day before. And so that's what I always take into consideration when I see these inconsistencies. And when I see this sort of insistence that there was a connection, because as of yet, we haven't seen any search warrants for Meta for Bryan Kohberger. Now, Meta owns Instagram. We haven't seen a warrant for that. That doesn't mean we won't, but we haven't seen one yet. So up to this point, as far as we know, Kohberger never had an Instagram account. But what I am going to say, we know that there were all these new warrants recently released, just recently unsealed last week. And they were for YouTube, Spotify, Venmo, and PayPal, and Apple. I think it was Apple Pay. I'm not sure. But if you looked at all the warrants, what you would see, they redacted the name on all of the warrants. And the only people we have seen them redact previously were the victims, as well as the other roommate that was on the survivors, and the other roommate that was on the lease, because they dug into her past as well. So I happen to think this latest round of warrants that have the name redacted, I think that they are warrants for devices owned by somebody else that they believe Kohberger could have used to, say, make a purchase of a knife, or to like send money to somebody to make a purchase of a knife, or to do any kind of research about how to commit a crime like this. So I'm thinking like maybe his parents, who did he, or maybe WSU, any other computer device that he had access to. I think that's who those warrants were for or what those warrants were for. So they're trying to find some kind of connection between him and the victims. But I think he was very, very smart. This is his area of expertise. Remember, when he applied for that internship with police, he wanted to assist with the collection of technological data. You know, he seems to have a pretty good idea of where police were going to go. Well, you know, what police were going to look for. Like I said, I think he left a sheath behind that was a sheath to a completely different knife, and not a sheath to the knife that was used in the crime. I happen to think he left the sheath behind on purpose. I think that he turned his phone on and off. I think he either, when he was driving home, he got lost because he took that long way home, and he was like, "Screw it, I've got to figure this out. How am I going to get home?" Or I think it was intentional, because there were a number of mistakes made, right? Like, we know he left the sheath behind. We wonder why he took his own car. We wonder why he took his phone. And the reason why everyone's confused is because they say, well, he's a criminology student. He would have known that. And I think exactly. That's going to be the defense. Well, he's a criminology student. You don't think he would know not to do that, not to take his own car, not to use his own phone? So part of me thinks some of it was intentional. I still think he drove his own car because he was acting on impulse that night, and that he always had the intention, always had everything in the car ready to go, and that was just the night where the impulse was just so strong that he couldn't fight it. And that could explain why he has had his phone with him as well. But I do think he made some intentional mistakes to mislead law enforcement, and some of them were just, he was just sloppy. So for me, the motive is obvious. He hated women. I said from the get-go, from the minute I first became invested in this case, that this was the case of an incel. And a lot of people are going to say, well, there's nothing that indicates he's an incel. Now, an incel is involuntary celibate. And remember, just because they haven't found any activity online from him doesn't mean there isn't any. It could just mean he was very smart about it, and sort of has been planning this for a very long time, and very intentionally only use, say, burner phones, or, you know, coffee shop laptops like Wi-Fi to do it. I do think that he was very smart about whatever he did online. And I'm really think my next video, I'd like to talk about the 4chan post, because I don't think Inside Looking or Papa Roger was Kohberger, but I absolutely believe Kohberger was behind the 4chan posts. And if you want me to go into that for the next video, just let me know in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to try and do this a little bit more regularly. I'm really excited at the interest that people have been taking in my channel, and so I want to create more content for you guys. If there's something specific you want me to cover, even if it's not Idaho 4 related, just let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time around.